resident-led, supported with the infrastructure that Natural Cambridge's partners can offer, to get on and create very small-scale improvements for nature across their areas, both urban, peri-urban, and rural. And certainly the pilot project that we launched in the north of the county around Peterborough has been an incredible success in that community mobilisation. One of the things I've said to many people is that it's the anarchic nature of it that gives it success. Each community is doing its own thing, getting on with its own thing, under the shelter of a vision, an umbrella, and some infrastructure. But one of the key lessons, I think, in that pilot is about not trying to get in the way of local people wanting to do stuff. And I think that will be the success that we want to see across Cambridgeshire. We now have plans to roll out that pilot across a couple of other areas, one on the Nene Valley and one in Cambridgeshire over the next few months. And we are hoping to work with the Future Parks project to take that forward. Another crucial piece of our work at the moment, which is being led by our friends in the Wildlife Trust, Martin Baker, is around getting in place a framework for the delivery of the biodiversity net gain initiative. And we want to put that in place so that we are really looking at strategic gain from that regime for those landscapes that we described, rather than penny pockets of individual activity. We do want a framework which drives the doubling nature agenda very strategically, whether it's from communities or whether it's from very large scale habitat restoration. We want it to be structured well rather than to be sort of random delivery. And we have re-established a working group that will be looking at that and taking that forward, working with planning authorities to try and ensure that we have a coherent regime for that. And then the fourth thing I wanted to touch on really was just to sort of pick up Helen's point about the interim report of the Climate Change Commission that was published yesterday. And I just saw in the chat someone asking for the link for that. We'll get that to you as soon as we can. It's very easily found on the Combined Authorities website. What I think was really important about that is not just the prominence that nature and nature recovery has in that report as one of the ways in which we can address the challenges of climate change mitigation and adaptation, but also the recognition of the public support for this agenda. As part of that report, the two surveys were commissioned, asking people about their priorities for climate change and what the Climate Change Commission should focus on. The first survey was one of those that you send out to your friends, and of course the answers you get are fairly expected. When I say friends, we're talking about 1,000 people or so. It was voluntary how you responded, and usually you only volunteer to respond to things if you're interested. The second one was where you actually use proper market research methods and you commission people. You go out and you randomly select people, but they're not necessarily environmentalists, conservationists, people we know. What was really interesting is that both those surveys, the number one thing that people wanted the commission to address, the number one priority for climate change adaptation, is nature recovery. And I think that's been well recognised by the response of the Commission and indeed by Mayor Palmer speaking at the Commission yesterday. And it's one of the questions we'll be asking to our mayoral candidates when they come to join us in an hour's time. And it really does feel, and I'd be interested at some stage perhaps in the chat, as if that public and policy mood music has changed. Nature recovery seems to be very central to thinking in a way that it wasn't even a year ago. I would note, for instance, the Oxfam policy paper on strategic planning and the emphasis on environmental opportunity areas. Many of us share different feelings and mixed feelings about the prospect of that growth agenda, but at least we are now seeing that the environment isn't sort of, some sub-paragraph on page 29. It was in the opening paragraph of that spatial strategy. And the determination to create those opportunity areas, I think, offers us another way of making and facilitating the doubling nature agenda and making it happen. So there's an awful lot going on. I hope I'm not, we're not approaching another period of false optimism for the nature conservation movement, but I just get a sense that we have now far more friends across business, across politics, across communities in particular. And it does seem as if we're at a sort of tipping point. Now, as Helen said, we certainly need to be, because if we don't act now, and I'm sure Brian will touch on this, then the prospects for the future are dire. But I do have a sense now of momentum within our movement, across our agenda, which I hope we can capture and take forward to delivery, and indeed hear about during the rest of this meeting. I'm sure there's lots more I could update on. This is one of the reasons we've got Helen in place. We will be producing much more detailed communication for you all going forward, so you can keep in touch with what we're doing. But I'm going to stop there for now. Enough from me, and move on to our first speaker. I see that Aidan very kindly has put the climate change report and the link there in the chat, so people can use that. If you've got questions for me, put them in the chat or email me directly. Otherwise, if I may, I'm looking for Matt. I'm going to hand over to Matt, who's going to talk to us about the nature recovery experience in the Nene Valley and drawing on the lessons of what's been achieved in the Northamptonshire and Peterborough area to see how that can be managed across the wider area as we go into spending too. Excellent. I can't see you, Matt. So you can.
I should be here somewhere.
There you are. You're right down the bottom of my screen.
Excellent.
Now, Matt, you've got some slides. You should also have the ability to share screen yourself. Is that the case?
It looks like I can, yeah.
So, Matt, you're representing the Wildlife Trust for Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire, and Northampton. You've been absolutely at the forefront of leading the nature recovery work in the Nene Valley. So it'd be really interesting to hear from you then, please, about that experience, what's worked, what hasn't, and any lessons learned for us here in Cambridgeshire.
Okay, yeah, that's great. Has that worked for sharing?
Certainly has.
Excellent. Yes, my name's Matt Johnson. I'm the Conservation Operations Manager for the Wildlife Trust in Northamptonshire, overseeing our wider countryside and our nature reserves work. And I've also been involved in the Nene Valley Nature Improvement Area for quite a number of years and kind of act as the main contact for that. And Oliver Burke is the chair of that group as well. So I've been asked to talk through a bit of about the conservation nature recovery work that's been happening in the Nene Valley, both in your end, sort of in the Peterborough end, and sort of the wider valley as well. I'm based in Northampton, lived here for quite a while, so I will at some point, probably about after the first slide, slip back into saying Nen rather than Nene, but hopefully you can forgive me for that. So in terms of what we call the Nene Valley, our work is basically focused from just the west of Northampton up to where the Nene becomes tidal around Peterborough. We've got an SPA sort of bang in the middle, which is what a lot of the focus of our conservation work. We've got the Eyes as the main tributary, and then we've got various sort of large country parks or nature reserves that are sort of the focus or the sort of the core parts of our nature recovery network. And we've been lucky that a lot of our work has been taking place through partnerships. One I mentioned, the Nature Improvement Area, which then led onto Nenscape, which was our Heritage Lottery funded project, which we're just starting the 4th year of now. And then we've also got an active local nature partnership that keeps a keen interest in the valley, and Destination Nene Valley, which is looking more at the tourism angle. So really, a lot of the work that we've done, sort of looking at nature recovery in the Nene Valley, came about from the Nature Improvement Area that Ollie was involved with as myself when Maximise was at the Trust. And we were one of the 12 NIAs that were selected to be a pilot to basically promote ecological restoration across the valley. And as you can see here, there's a whole range of partners that were involved in that. And a lot of this work built on sort of the existing landscape scale conservation action that organisations like the Wildlife Trust and the RSPB through their living landscapes and futurescapes were aiming to achieve. And really the NIA was brilliant in bringing together sort of partners that had worked in some areas in the past, but bringing them together with a sort of a shared set of objectives for the valley. And you can see here our sort of what we said was our objectives sort of statement at the start. And then we had 5 main priorities that we wanted to try and deliver through the Nature Improvement Area funded period. They were planning and development, access and recreation, river restoration, land management, and ecosystem services. And I'll take you through sort of each one of those 5 objectives and what's been achieved and what we're hoping to achieve on the ground through those. Because when we got to the end of the funded period of the NIA in around 2015, we kind of revisited our overall action plan and decided that they were still the 5 main objectives for the Valley, and they were what we wanted to progress. And we mainly did that through a continued partnership and then successful application to what was then HLF for our landscape partnership scheme, which is NENscape. So the first of those objectives is growth and development, supporting a natural environment. There was a lot of focus on sort of the larger applications and getting a consistent view and response from the various organisations in the Valley to what we wanted to see those applications deliver for nature. And also a lot of work of getting both the NIA and the Special Protection Area, the SPA, into policy, which we've seen the benefits of in future years. A lot of that work was done at a sort of local authority scale because of the way planning is, but there was some input from the Peterborough side of things as well. And a lot of that work has now led into our second objective, which is maximising public awareness and sort of promoting a sustainable sympathetic use of the Valley, in particular the SPA, because we've got this special protection area, but its main threat is due to recreational pressure. So we've had a special protection area supplementary planning document and mitigation strategy that's been in place for a number of years now. And because a lot of that recreational pressure wasn't just coming from applications on the edge of the SPA, but from increased visitors from a sort of a 3-kilometre buffer that we concluded, then there's a charge of just going up to £299 per house for any development that occurs within 3 kilometres of the SPA. And that goes into a funding pot that's administered by the local authorities with a partnership of Natural England Wildlife Trust, and funds a variety of projects such as fencing and screening on sites, better signage, diverting rights of way, and sort of promoting safe and sympathetic use of the SPA. And we've also just started looking at functionally linked land, so where our birds go to roost when they're out of the SPA, and whether there's we can pick out the most important areas that are sort of 10-kilometre buffer around the SPA to try and protect them and ensure that future development we don't lose those habitats as well. And that's been a really key bit of work in engaging with the local authorities and the planning system to ensure that we've got funds to ensure management and public access of the SPA continues well. And at the same time, through NENscape, we had a funded project called Access for All, which has been working with Destination Nene Valley to promote the SPA and its overwintering birds to the local populations. We did some mapping, which you can see an example of here, based on pulling some data out of Strava to try and understand where the hotspots were for people visiting these various sites. And that's then inputted into the screening and the signage work that I just previously mentioned. We've had sort of stalls at the Nene Valley Festival and done some social media sort of promotions as well, about just trying to explain to people how valuable, how internationally important this site is, and how their one dog walk a day can impact in combination with everyone else's. We've got hopefully some plans to recruit some volunteer wardens when that kind of thing becomes more possible in the future. So that kind of ties in sort of those two aspects, which are very much sort of, they've more focused on the Northamptonshire side of the NIA and the Nene Valley, just basically because they've been sort of situated and focused around the SPA. But our third main objective, improving the ecological status of the river through river restoration, has focused across the whole of the valley. We had some funded work through the NIA, and then that's been continued by the 5-year Resilient River project through NENscape. So working with the EA, we've had a funded project officer to deliver predominantly backwater and back channel restoration projects, because that's where the real wins are for the Nene Valley, with the main channel generally being used for navigation. And we've assessed and prioritised most of the back channels and backwaters across the Nene, and then from that prioritisation process aim to restore 3 or 4 per year with the funding. So we've got up to now 2.7 kilometres of river restored. We've introduced clean gravel, hinged and pinned trees, And at this sort of Peterborough end, Aylesworth and Castor, the back channels there, were some of the first ones we did in the project. And we're hoping we can do some stuff around the electric cut in Peterborough before the end of the project as well, which would be really good. Our fourth objective was around land management and working with farmers and landowners for effective engagement to try and strengthen the ecological network. So that led to, through our NAA project, to our Farming for the Future project. As you may have seen on Countryfowl a couple of weeks ago, we've got a full-time land advisor based with the Wildlife Trust who runs a capital grant scheme for landowners in the valley, focusing on meadow and wetland restoration, as well as giving whole farm stewardship advice. And also sort of runs a little working group with other land advisors in the valley, such as the Natural England team, catchment sensitive farming, FWAG, etc. Just to coordinate advice and the running of events between them, so that we're giving a consistent message to landowners, and we can target our advice and our funds to best create and restore habitats. And that work has happened all the way across the valley. One of our biggest projects was some rotary ditching. So that started off at Ferry Meadows, which this photo is taken here, and did a further 6 sites in the valley stretching between Peterborough and Northampton, and created over 7 kilometres of infield ditches to try and sort of create some restored habitat for breeding waders, focusing on lapwing and redshank. And we've still got another couple of years of that project to go, and working with Helen, our land advisor, is based in Peterborough, so she has done quite a bit of work with the landowners in that area, which is really positive. And the new strand of that work has led to a ELMS test and trial, so the new environmental land management scheme. We've had some funding from DEFRA to test some of our habitat opportunity mapping, which I'll come to in a minute, to firstly see if we can prioritise land holdings for stewardship to help deliver our nature recovery network. And then secondly, to trial with individual farmers what is the benefit of using opportunity mapping to produce farmer-led whole farm plans. So in the early stages of that, there's some examples here of some of the mapping that we've taken to an individual farm to look at if they were doing a new stewardship scheme using this mapping, would that influence them on where they put the options to link up with habitats outside of their farm to help us create that nature recovery network. And this opportunity mapping has come from a sort of a 10-year project that started off from the 5th of our Nene Valley objectives, marketing ecosystem services. So first off, in the NIA, we valued the ecosystem services that the Valley provides at just over £118 million per year. And then from that, we looked at how we can enhance and improve those through habitat opportunity mapping. So this first step, I think, is similar to what has been done in Cambridgeshire, working with Natural Capital Solutions. We've done opportunity mapping for woodlands, wetlands and grasslands using existing data, which thanks to our mapping of local wildlife sites, we've got fairly good existing data for priority habitats in Northamptonshire and into Peterborough. We've identified buffers and stepping stone habitats, which you can see here. And then we've also mapped the top various percentages of fields. So we've done this on a whole field scale, where the best opportunities are to create those habitats to benefit water quality, water flow, air quality, and access and recreation. And then we've been able to overlap those to show combined maps of where creating new habitats can benefit multiple ecosystem services. So the darker the colour on these maps here, the more ecosystem services are being benefited by creating a habitat in a certain field. And then finally, through some workshops, we identified the priority areas that we wanted to focus on for delivering habitats to benefit ecosystem services. And as you can see from this map here, the Nene Valley was picked out as one of those priority areas to really focus down where we wanted to try and engage landowners to deliver that nature recovery network. So that takes you through a kind of, need to go back. That takes you through our kind of 5 objectives that we've been working on in the Nene Valley. Just a little bit to end up is upcoming projects. Stanwick Lakes, our large country park, have got funding from the Green Recovery Fund recently to improve their visitor engagement around conservation work there. The Wildlife Trust's hopefully we've got provisional funding from Highways England Network for Nature funding to really improve habitats and visitor access to our 3 main nature reserves. And also we're hoping to sort of bring our habitat opportunity project to more of a conclusion by providing a natural capital investment plan based on the opportunity mapping. And then just to briefly finish off with some of the lessons learned through both the nature improvement area and the Nenscape project. Probably not sort of anything that's earth-shattering, but really the strength of the partnership is probably the main thing that's come out of both those 2 schemes. The NIA was a really good way of bringing together partners that had been working together to some extent to really have a shared vision for the valley, share resources, share ambitions, and that partnership has continued through the working group to today, which has led to a lot of good stuff happening on the ground, and also led to Nenscape happening, which brought in some wider partners from the more heritage angle as well, which has really helped. Having consistent funding has been a massive input. We realised a lot of our work that we did through the nature improvement area kind of stagnated, where we waited for Nenscape to start going, but then that 5 years of funding has been really beneficial. It's proved that you can really do this stuff cross-county. We've done a lot of stuff across Northamptonshire and Peterborough just by working across the Nene Valley that we probably wouldn't have done if we were working on sort of those local authority boundaries. And then lastly, just having sort of dedicated posts, so the river restoration officer and particularly the land advisor, to have a consistent point for landowners, farmers and people to come to get that advice and deliver these projects, and often can take quite a few years getting through the various provisional studies to delivering things onto ground to monitor them going forwards has been a real benefit. And I think hopefully you're looking at potentially having a land advisor working in other parts of Cambridgeshire, which I think will be really beneficial as well. So yeah, that's the end of my presentation. Hopefully that gives you a brief overview of what we've been up to, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. And I think we are going to forgive you for your mispronunciation of the lovely name, but that's okay for now. I'm sure we've got lots of questions. I can see some coming up. I wanted to start off, if I may. You're obviously working in large areas that are heavily populated, and you mentioned something about dog walking. And I wondered, you know, is this one of the coming conflicts for the nature conservation movement, the pressure of the people who want to love and enjoy the countryside in a way that might not necessarily be great for nature? Is that something you're actively addressing?
Yeah, I think it's been quite an issue in the Nene Valley for a while, because we've got the special protection area in a very urban part of the valley. We have 20,000 overwintering birds, which is what the main designation is for each winter. And sort of dog walking, we've had various studies of bird disturbance studies, and kind of dog walking alongside jogging and some of the other sort of more active recreational sports are the main disturbance issues. We've been looking at that on a kind of a side-by-side scale, trying to identify where the hotspots are, put in screening, sort of divert footpaths away and put in hides so people can see the wildlife but also aren't disturbing it so much, and kind of trying to figure out exactly how it works. We've done some interesting studies where if you have people constantly approaching a path on one direction, the birds see them approaching, the birds are fairly fine. If you have people approaching the same path in the opposite direction but suddenly appear from behind a tree, that leads to disturbance, birds flying away, feeding less. So it's understanding those really nuanced issues. And then also, just due to lockdown, COVID, etc., we've seen massive increases of visitors to nature reserves, and we're really trying to work out how we can get that message across of kind of sensible enjoyment of the countryside and particularly nature reserves. And hopefully we've had this idea of sort of training up volunteer sort of stewards or champions for the Nene Valley that can kind of spread that message out, and that's something we're hoping to get forward in the next couple of years. Really
interesting and very sensitive issue, and one I think we're all going to have to come to grips with over the coming years. On the one hand, we want people enjoying the countryside, being active and being healthy, but that comes with pressures. Let me turn to a couple of questions in the chat. Matt, we've got one from Helen Boothman here. How are you measuring and evaluating the success of the public awareness objective of the SPA?
Probably not particularly well. We're kind of trying to do it with our partners at Destination Nene Valley and kind of looking at sort of obviously social media interaction, sort of face-to-face interaction when it was occurring through their activities and their Nene Valley Festival. When we've had people out doing wardening, kind of doing some questionnaires of kind of how aware people are of the Nene Valley and the features that it's designated for. But yeah, it was something that we kind of started to get going before COVID, and then have had to kind of radically change what we're doing, and probably how we monitor that is something we've not quite got the best hang of yet.
So more work to be done on that. And then I'm delighted that Charles Crawford has asked a question with 2 acronyms in it in one sentence. So congratulations, Charles. Matt, are you making use of SANG to divert recreational pressures away from the SPA? Do you want to explain what SANG is first?
Yeah, so SANG's basically where you're creating new recreational green space as part of developments outside of the existing nature reserves, habitats, green spaces. So kind of trying to spread that recreational green pressure elsewhere. And yes, we're definitely doing that with some of the larger new sustainable urban extensions and things like that. One of the problems we've found is that the larger developments that will deliver the SANGs are taking years or decades to actually come online, and the sort of the smaller developments that are happening quickly and gradually increasing the number of residents in the vicinity of the valley are leading to increased disturbance that the new green space will address at some point, but we're in between those 2 things happening at the moment. So it's definitely an option for the future, but something that always seems to take a lot longer to take place than you expect.
Yeah, absolutely. I quite understand that. Now, the next question is from Tony Booth, and you may decide to defer this one, Matt, and pass it to Brian. But up to you. Have you had any second thoughts about being part of Nature's Ark? And then Tony makes some subjective comments about it being unsustainable greenwash. And, do you want to take that one, or do you want to hand it up the line?
I think I'll happily hand that one up the line.
Excellent. Well, can we just, Tony, no offense, we'll pause that one and we'll ask it to Brian at the end of his presentation. Is that all right, Tony? I think that was a thumbs up, I think. I don't know, actually.
And I can say from my point of view that
Keep going, Matt. Hold on a second.
Yeah, it was more of a thumbs down. I mean,
okay. Well, anyway, we're going to answer the question, Tony, but we're going to answer it at the end of Brian's session. So
I can briefly say that we've kind of been working with increasing sort of housing numbers in the Nene Valley, regardless of the ARC, and we feel it's a benefit to have what the objectives and the opportunity mapping and the ideas that we have for improving nature that can benefit from ARC.
It's just the marketing.
Okay, sorry, Tony. I think that was I clicked the wrong button. I didn't mute you deliberately. We will come back on that one, honestly. I just want to finish the conversations with Matt. Matthew Bullock has asked about revenue generating opportunities. Is that how's that working out, Matt? Are you able now to generate money through the visitor experience that is actually then being able to push into investment in nature?
To some extent, yes, but obviously we've kind of found that the more visitors you get, the more expensive your nature reserves come to manage. So it is funding some of that work, but not sort of generating a huge amount of profit. We're kind of hoping that through our opportunity mapping and then the creation of a natural capital investment plan, that hopefully that will put us in a good place to start generating some investment going forwards in time, but not something we've really realised yet.
Very good. And final question, I think, sort of not really a question, but Martin Lyons has posted something in the chat about the experience of commercial farmers in the Cambridgeshire region and what they're doing to adapt their farming practices. What's your experience been, Matt, with the agricultural community, which is hugely important to our agenda? Do you feel that they're working with you under sufferance, or do you feel a passion and engagement with the farming community?
I think we've probably got the whole, as with everywhere, I've got the whole range of kind of farmers' viewpoints, but generally it's been very positive. We've got a lot of landowners and farmers in the valley that have kind of worked their way through all the various stewardship schemes, starting from the old countryside stewardship to HLS and looking at the new ones, and also have worked on us kind of through Farming for Future, to deliver habitat improvements that stewardship's never been able to do, and have a genuine interest in the valley. And John Gent kind of, I think, summed that up really well when he was on Country Fell the other week. And they've seen the valley change from their lifetime, from before some of the gravel extraction to how it is now. And yeah, I think the generally really positive and happy to try and work with nature, the increased flooding that we're getting, etc., to improve, to sort of have sustainable farming, but to improve wildlife alongside of that.
Yeah, lovely. We've got a couple of other questions in the chat, which I'm going to have to pause. I need to move on to our next presentation. Matt, if you had time to perhaps engage with those questions in the chat, what we're staying on the call, that would be great. But thank you, Matt, for that. It's been really, really useful to see that. And if you look at where you are, I think, with the spatial prioritization, with the habitat opportunities mapping, that's really powerful and I think hugely important to the farming community. It'd be interesting to see how that actually works in practice, how it comes forward. But yeah, thank you so much for your time, Matt, and look forward to working with you in the future, and particularly, obviously, from our point of view, in the Cambridgeshire-Peterborough area of the Nene.
Thank you.
Very much. Great stuff. Well, I don't know whether this was design or just accident, but Matt is now followed by the Chief Executive of the Bedfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire Wildlife Trust, Brian Eversham. Brian, it's great to see you. How are you?
Very well indeed. I'm very glad to be here.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think really, you're such a crucial part of the agenda and of the doubling nature agenda. It would be, and doing such fabulous work across the three counties, but it'd just be lovely to hear from you and get your views on the future in Cambridgeshire, the opportunity and the work that the Wildlife Trust is doing to make it happen. Thank you.
Right, well, thanks very much indeed, Richard. I don't have any presentation, so I'm afraid it's just me talking for 15 minutes or so. Matt's given a brilliant overview of one of the landscape scale schemes that the Trust's been involved with for a very long time. The one other message I'd pick out of that, which Matt didn't quite stress, is the great skill that conservation bodies have built up over the last 20 or 30 years of taking opportunistic time-limited funding pots and stringing them together to make a big long-term project. And that, I fear, is going to be an underlying theme of an awful lot of what we're going to do now and in the next 5 or 10 years. I thought what I could usefully do would actually be to put our current position in something of a historical context and look at the direction of travel for the Wildlife Trust's work and how that fits in with wider partnerships. So I'll take you back, possibly beyond some of your memories, back to the mid-1990s. My predecessor as Conservation Director of the Wildlife Trust, Adrian Colston. Adrian published an article in 1995 called Conservation in a Black Hole. And his black hole was that cluster of 6 English counties with less than half the national average of protected land for wildlife. There are 6 counties with 3.5% or less SSSI, when the national figure is about 7%. And those are Cambridgeshire with Peterborough, Bedfordshire, Northamptonshire, so the whole of my patch, plus Leicestershire, Warwickshire and West Midlands. And Adrian's point was very clear and very simple. In that part of the country, more than anywhere else, the status quo for nature just isn't good enough. If you like, this was the first glimmerings of the doubling nature message, that protecting wildlife in small isolated nature reserves, however well they're looked after and managed, is not sustainable. Species will go extinct, and that'll be through random processes, not through necessarily bad management, but a cold spring, a summer drought, anything like that can knock out certain species. A hostile countryside means they can't recolonize, and they're therefore gone from ever, and sites gradually decline. So out of that paper came the recognition of landscape scale conservation as our priority, tied in the early 2000s to the concept of climate change threatening wildlife, and our sector, the wildlife sector, being particularly about adaptation to climate change. And that became, for the Wildlife Trust's, Living Landscapes. Now, Adrian then went on to launch the Wick and Fen vision. It's very good to see Sarah in the group today. That amazing project still speeding ahead and achieving a huge amount on the ground. And in 1997, I just joined the Wildlife Trust, and one of my first jobs was to write the first ever grant application for what became the Great Fen. And I shall come back to that later in the presentation. So by the year 2000, this Wildlife Trust had written our first 5-year plan, which identified 9 priority areas which we thought could achieve the most by focusing our effort. And starting in the south of our patch, that was the North Chilterns Chalk, the Greensand Ridge and Flit Vale in Bedfordshire. In Northamptonshire, the Rockingham Forest. Overlapping Cambridgeshire, as we've heard, the Nene Valley leading into the Nene Valley. John Clare Country, the Great Fen, the Great Ouse Valley, what we now call the West Cambridgeshire Hundreds, but in 2000 we were referring to as the South Cambridgeshire Forest, and I'll come back to that point as well, and the Cambridgeshire Chalk. And you'll note that's largely defined by geology with some topography, and that's simply because the right rocks and the right topography create the right soils, create the potential for habitats, and those are the places where fragments of high quality habitat have survived, the places with the highest concentrations of rare and threatened species, the things we'll lose if we don't act, and also the things that make this part of central England special. And I'll just show you, it's a Northamptonshire story, but I think it applies everywhere. I met the new chief exec of one of the Northants district councils a few years back. He'd been in post for about 6 months, and I explained what his district meant to me from a wildlife point of view, the Nene Valley, some of the woodlands, some of the other wetland habitats. And at the end of it, he said, that was amazing. I've been here 6 months and you're the first person to make me think this part of Northamptonshire is special. And I think as wildlife enthusiasts, we recognise local distinctiveness and character that does give us special opportunities and special priorities that no one else has. So never lose that sense of this is something special and important. So by 2003, the label of living landscapes had been adopted by all 46 wildlife trusts. Every trust had its own landscape scale scheme, and we had a little mantra to go with it, bigger, better and joined up, which is remarkably similar to the slogan that came out of the Lawton Review, Making Space for Nature, back in 2010. Also by about 2003, 2005, other organisations, National Trust, RSPB, Woodland Trust, were starting to think landscape scale and focus on climate change adaptation. And I would say that since that first 5-year plan back in 2000, the Trust's work across its 9 living landscapes has been frankly opportunistic. There have been peaks of activity, there have been times when things have been chugging along at a relatively low level, entirely dependent on when land is available for purchase or when landowners become interested, where partnerships develop which allow big new things to happen, or where a sudden injection of funding makes things possible. And I say sudden, it's often a 5-year lead-in for 3 years of intensive activity with, say, a large lottery partnership. Now, of the 9 schemes, only the Great Fen relies on land purchase as its main mechanism for delivery. And that was thought from the very beginning to be necessary because to create large-scale wetland, you need to restore water tables. That needs complete control over water management, and therefore we set out ultimately to own 9,000 acres of low-lying land. In the rest of the 9 schemes, land purchase can be an important part, particularly where there are crucial existing habitats that need to be in really good management to act as the sort of reservoir of species which will colonise created habitats elsewhere. And in other places, acquiring land from developers or in partnership, working with landowners, providing advice and practical help and funding to landowners, advising local authorities, commenting on local plans, getting the right green infrastructure in those local plans. And something the Wildlife Trust has been involved in since probably the 1970s is the rather dull work of setting up the network of local wildlife sites, surveying and resurveying those sites and advising landowners on the management of that network of local wildlife sites. And I'd stress that particularly in a place where the SSSIs are so few and far between and so inadequate as a network, that local wildlife sites actually do play a really big part. And I hope that the new old scheme from government will actually recognise the value of getting those top sites back into decent management. I don't think the Trust got it right by any means all the way through that, even though the first 9 schemes are things we're still focused on, and I think the targeting was right. The classic example for me, I think, was where you have a big idea, but you don't talk to the local people and local landowners before you start. So we glibly launched a South Cambridgeshire Forest Plan and only latterly discovered that the farmers who owned much of the land in the area had no wish to be farming in a forest. So within a couple of years, we'd rebranded it as the West Cambridgeshire Hundreds, which I have to say is a far less exciting title, but actually got support from dozens of landowners. And we've had a very active farm cluster there. It's raised the profile of oxlip and bluebell woods. It's now seen 20 odd farmers reconnecting woodland, increasing woodland cover on their own land at their own expense through their own initiative. And that's the way that landscapes can change long term, by local people deciding we want this to happen, not by some know-all organisation saying, let's have a forest here, which would have achieved absolutely nothing on its own. Looking forward, I think the next 5 years probably have greater opportunities to speed the process of connectivity beyond anything we've seen so far. I've great hopes for the new Environment Act. We're looking forward to a legally based nature recovery area. Taking Tony Booth's point about Oxcam Arc, it's a mixed blessing, but if development happens, then mandatory biodiversity net gain can only be a good thing. And my own sense is that there's also a lot of scope around carbon storage and sequestration as part both of ongoing business as usual and for any future development. But I'm happy to say more about that perhaps in the question and discussion. One thing I would say, though, is that with biodiversity net gain and nature recovery networks, meaning that politicians are taking a deeper interest in the work of our sector than ever before, if there's a single message for them all, I think it's the right habitats in the right place. Tree planting is not the only answer. Even creating woodland, you don't necessarily need to plant trees. Nature's quite capable of doing that for you if you simply sit back and let it. But it's worth remembering, particularly for Cambridgeshire, that healthy peatlands store far more carbon per unit area than forests do. And even functioning floodplain grasslands can store more carbon per unit area because they've got such carbon-rich soils compared with a woodland. You walk through a wood and you're basically walking in fresh air between a few trees. You walk over a wet meadow or over a peatland and you are standing on a peat-rich substrate all the way through. So a nature recovery network that covers the full range of important habitats will do a great deal to tackle the extinction crisis, as well as actually setting us up to tackle the climate crisis. So however we phrased it over the year, be it landscape scale conservation, living landscapes, futurescapes, doubling nature, it's the right approach, working on a bigger scale, working in partnership, tackling extinction, tackling climate change alongside it. And that takes me finally onto the Great Fen, which was the first and so far the most prominent and possibly the most successful of our 9 living landscapes. Already, by restoring the peatlands in the Great Fen from arable farming to wet grassland and grazing, we've locked up between 6 and 12 million tonnes of carbon dioxide, which otherwise would have been released into the atmosphere in the next 70 or 80 years as the peat erodes. Now, depending on whose figures you read, lowland arable peat may be responsible for half the carbon dioxide from UK farming, and rather less confidently may be responsible for half the carbon dioxide produced in Cambridgeshire at the moment. Now, if that's not true, the reason it's not true is that we've already lost huge volumes of peat. In other words, the carbon dioxide has been released over the last century rather than sitting in the ground to be released in future. And I'm not sure that that should actually give us a great deal of comfort. But whatever the figures, loss of peat is significant and it's wasteful, and peat soils are an incredibly valuable resource. And a wide range of farmers are looking at regenerative farming techniques which will help retain that peat more effectively in future. In the Great Fen, we're piloting the idea of wet farming, growing a range of new crops. And the ones that we're trialling at the moment are Phragmites reed for producing things like fiberboard, float grass or manna grass, Glyceria, as a sort of European wild rice or European sacred porridge. It's a crop that has a long history in parts of Europe. Typha or reed mace, again good for fiberboard, also very good at its tubers as cattle feed, but most amazingly of all, sphagnum bog moss. Anybody who knows sphagnum will be aware of its ability to transform its own environment, to store and draw up huge volumes of water. It's also biocidal. It's a great antibiotic antiseptic material. Now, back of the envelope calculations right now suggest that sphagnum, just used as a horticultural growing medium, can produce between 8 and 10 times the profit of growing winter wheat or oilseed rape. If there's a biomedical use in wound dressings, or better still, I suggest, an absorbency role in sanitary products globally, then sphagnum could have enormous sustainable potential. And I dream of a time when any farmer with wet peat is grateful for the fact that he can keep his peat wet and grow sphagnum, rather than drain it, erode it, and grow anything else less profitable and less sustainable. Now, 20 years ago, when we were first mapping out the major habitats of the 3 counties, or planning how to link Woodwalton Fen to Home Fen in what's now the Great Fen, I would never have dreamt the Wildlife Trust would be spending its own fundraised money on piloting farming experiments. But if wet farming became the norm, among other collateral benefits, it would actually resolve the drainage issues that threaten surviving upstanding blocks of peat on our fenland nature reserves. And it makes wetland reconnection across the landscape vastly more likely. So I think the last 20 years are telling us there will be surprises and with things you're not expecting. Go with the flow, take the opportunity, and cross your fingers and assume the funding will be available, because if the project's good enough, the money will come. Thank you.
Brilliant, Brian. Thank you as ever. Really, really good to hear all of that. And I think fascinating to look at the economics of this. I suspect it's perhaps something that in his original paper, Adrian Coulson wasn't doing, perhaps, but recognizing the economics, recognizing also, you know, this sort of rather the approach that's now being outlined in the Das Gupta report. There's some fundamental shifts. I would say, Brian, if you've got a copy of that paper from 1995, I'd love to see it, but that's a separate issue. I have to ask Richard Townley what he saw out of his window, because he had his binoculars to his eyes. So anything useful, Richard? Any good nature spotted?
Very boring, only a pheasant.
Nice, very good. Thank you. A few comments in the chat before we come to the questions. Thank you, Rachel, for mentioning Wild East. Yes, we're very keen to work with you, as you know, and I think we've got some meetings set up. And similarly, Robin, we're very keen to work and be part of the Water Resources East aspect as well. Shall we just be fair to Tony and ask this question about the ARC again, Brian? I mean, where do we stand as the nature conservation movement on not just the ARC, but, you know, growth generally and the prospects of further development, further housing, and all the infrastructure that comes with? What's the right response to the nature conservation movement?
Yeah, I think to answer the point directly, the green arc idea was probably a good one, but it really demonstrates the difficulty of a consortium of conservation bodies trying to come up with a set of words together, when each of them could probably do a better job on their own. If you've got organisations which are concerned about particular habitats or particular groups of plants or animals, in this case birds, you end up with the risk of the lowest common denominator of what everybody can sign up to. So for the Wildlife Trust, I could easily say, we oppose an expressway. We don't believe a target of 1 million homes is realistic, and that needs to be built on environmental priorities. Other organisations may not be able to sign up to something like that. Some have very particular sites they need to protect, and that's their overriding priority. I do think, though, that if we keep the evidence to ourselves and say, well, we know what needs to happen, but we're not telling you nasty developers until you actually put your plans on the table, we run the risk of always following the development rather than being able to say, these areas are so sympathetic, they must not be developed. These areas are important for wildlife, and whatever happens there will need to go with the grain of the landscape. The difficulty of ever publishing any map is that they're always the white bits, the bits that aren't of high heritage or wildlife value or anything else, and which can be seen as targeting places where development should happen. So the Wildlife Trust's never been saying development should happen, and I wouldn't want to predicate the future of conservation on the back of money from development. It's one funding source which may be available. But on the other hand, I'm not foolish enough to say there will be no development, therefore we can ignore it. Whatever we say as a group, as a collective, as a movement, we're not yet powerful enough to say no more houses between Oxford and Cambridge. It's going to happen, and it's our choice whether it happens in the best possible way or the worst way. My sense is through 20 years of fighting a rearguard action and objecting to the worst developments, it gets you so far. Partnerships with developers can actually do better. And if you look at our site at Trumpington Meadows, the housing's relatively small and discreet, and the nature reserve's got long-term value. And I think that prospect of finding developers who you can work with, and maybe occasionally identifying some where it's just not possible. Their plans are so appalling that you've just got to say no, mean no, and keep saying no.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Brian. A couple of questions in the chat, more comments than questions. How is monetizing nature achieved without putting in car parks, coffee stores, and fast food outlets, which can lead to destructive levels of visitor concentration? I think that's a very fair point, David. I think it's something I go back to the question I asked Matt about visitor numbers in the countryside, which on the one hand, we absolutely want more people interested in the countryside and nature, but how do we manage the visitor pressures? I mean, Brian, do you have any further thoughts on that at all?
What I would say is that I think we maybe need to rethink what we mean by access. Access isn't entirely about walking dogs. Some of the best nature reserves on the planet don't allow you to walk into the middle of them. I mean, I've had several fantastic holidays in the south of France in the Camargue, where you've got a relatively small number of viewing points and huge areas of pretty inaccessible terrain. In that case, it's helped by having these huge wild bulls roaming around freely, which are a pretty good disincentive to dog walkers and everybody else. So with something like the Great Fen, we've identified some areas with very, very limited access, but there will be hides and viewpoints around the outside. And if you've got 2,000 acres of decent wetland, which people can see into but not enter, then I think you can actually manage the two. But on small isolated sites, it's always going to be a real problem.
And doesn't that take us back to Lawton? We just need, you know, in order to manage those twin pressures, we need bigger sites and many more of them.
And I think the other thing is to link back to the question earlier about strategic new green space. It's far easier to manage visitors and minimise damage on a large new piece of ground which had little or no wildlife on day one than trying to retrofit thousands of visitors on an existing small nature reserve. So we need honeypot sites that are built with the infrastructure. Again, one of my happiest moments a few years ago was talking to one of the Trust's regular major donors who lived in Cambridge and regularly went to Wicken Fen, and apologies to Sarah here. I had a meeting with them at Camborne, walked them around Camborne, and they then added Camborne as a place to cycle to from Cambridge to look at wildlife. And the idea that within 20 years, on the back of a large housing development, we've created good enough landscape and habitat to attract relatively discerning visitors to cycle 15 miles to have a day trip to see the wildlife of Camborne, I thought was a really powerful moment.
Very, very interesting. Just a couple of other quick things in the chat. There's a point here about tree surgeons and wood chip and how we manage that, use biochar and help accelerate wetland restoration. There's also a point about landscape spatial strategy, which Wendy has raised in the chat. Do you think that's, do we do enough or to plan spatially in this country, Brian, and to give nature its place in that?
I think we probably do enough planning. What we don't do is actually agree a plan and stick to it.
Right.
I was involved in the very first biodiversity action plans back in the 1990s, and the language was slightly different, but the aims were very similar. And the very first habitat opportunity maps and green infrastructure maps, again, are getting on for 20 years old. One other practical experience, in Northamptonshire, we had two approaches to opportunity mapping. We had a large number crunching one. So we got a huge amount of data on habitats at 1 kilometre square resolution and finer resolution. And we spent about 6 months crunching the numbers to come up with a map of the best places to create each habitat. The other thing we did was get a large paper map out, put it on the table and get 6 people who knew the county pretty well to spend a couple of hours with felt tip pens. And the two approaches were about 95% coherent. It's pretty blatantly obvious where the best habitats are going to have to be, where the soil's right, where the existing wildlife is. It doesn't need a huge amount of careful number crunching to get a pretty good broad brush outline. I just hope that the current exercises and the Nature Recovery Network is the last one, and that says, this is it, these areas are sacrosanct, these areas are vital for connectivity, these areas are less vital. And yes, the flip side of that is the danger of flagging up white spaces for development. But if you roll that back to say development needs to be zero carbon and net zero water and at least 10% pro biodiversity, and I'd love to see the net gain figures rise to 25%, because I don't believe we can measure biodiversity within 10%. So 10% net gain is probably status quo if you're lucky. 25% would actually be a significant new boundary. And generally, developers don't care what number you set as long as everybody else has to do the same.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm seeing some supportive comments in the chat on that. Brian, I think we pretty much come to the end of time. Your presentation today. Any final comments you'd like to leave us with?
Stick to it. Some of us have been in this game a long time. It's lovely to see a lot of new faces, and very importantly, I'm seeing more and more local politicians actually taking this agenda seriously because people care about it. And it goes back to your earlier point, Richard, about community engagement. If this really matters to people, then this is going to be what politicians deliver. If people would rather have social investment or purely urban parks, then they'll get that. If our agenda is the one that people understand and buy into, and I think COVID's given us the best opportunity ever in a really sad and desperate way, people now believe green space matters to them. Politicians are starting to recognise that's what people believe. We need to deliver it for them. Thank
you, Brian. And can you say on behalf of us all, thank you to you individually for the inspirational work you've done over all that time, and to the Trust. It does a fantastic job. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Richard.
Right, on to the next item on our agenda. Do apologise to anybody if I'm not capturing everything that's coming up in the chat. It's hard to get it all in, but do keep putting your comments there, please. Next up, we're going to be having a look and a presentation on it's entitled The Natural Environment Aspects of the Greater Cambridge Local Plan. And I'm reliably informed that we don't have John Cornell presenting, although I think he's here, but in fact, we've got Stuart Morris. So Stuart, are you here? Are you on the chat? Please say yes.
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can, and I can see you now as well. Great stuff. And Stuart, have you got some slides as well?
Yes, I do. I will seek to try and share them.
You should have a share screen function, so hopefully you will. So yeah, about a quarter of an hour of talking, Stuart, and then some questions. That'd be great. Just while you're doing that, Stuart, I know there's quite a lot of comments around spatial strategy, and there is some work that we're trying to take forward. I think Dame Fiona Reynolds is on the call, and we're looking to work with her and some of her colleagues on some emerging ideas around county-wide spatial strategies for nature. Hopefully we can come back to that at some stage. Fiona, do you want to very quickly interject? I see you waving.
Yeah, only to say, yes, absolutely. Very keen to help and work in partnership on the bigger picture for the, in a sense, the whole of Cambridgeshire. But, you know, I'm listening with great enjoyment to all of these presentations and look forward to yours. Thank you.
Great stuff. Good to have you with you. Thank you, Dan. Fiona. Right, Stuart, you're ready. Off you go.
Can you see the screen, by the way, just to check?
We can. Lovely.
Great stuff. So yeah, thank you. So my name's Stuart Morris. I'm from the Planning, Policy and Strategy and Economy team within Greater Cambridgeshire Planning, which is for Cambridge City Council and South Cambridgeshire District Council. My colleague John Cornell, who's the Natural Environment team leader, is here as well. The reason his name was on the agenda was just that my wife is due to give birth any day now, so I wasn't quite sure I'd be here, but we're still hanging on in there, so we'll keep on going. And I should note I'm not an expert across all of these range of topics, so I may not be able to answer your questions, but John and I will do our best. So just to provide a brief overview and kind of reminder, if you weren't already aware, so the Greater Cambridge Local Plan to cover Cambridge and South Cambs is a long process with a long gestation period. So there was the first conversation consultation, which your first big dark green box on the left there was early last year. And then the last big kind of public stage was we published a range of initial evidence findings in autumn last year. And we're currently working up the evidence and working towards a preferred options consultation summer autumn this year, which is likely to include the preferred strategy, including all the sites and policy areas, but not the detailed policy wording. And you can see that the timing of and the future stages run on for a few years, and hopefully that's in some ways helpful. It allows for further input from the public. I guess also in terms of understanding the impacts of COVID, and also the emerging work on nature recovery strategies provides additional opportunity to actually integrate some of that. In terms of the big themes of the plan, you might recall that there were 7 big themes from the first conversation. So you can see this first one, the first kind of 4 at the top of the tree there, including biodiversity and green spaces, but also the other themes and climate change mentioned earlier. And then homes, infrastructure and jobs as being seen through the lens of those 4 big themes. And consultation responses identified that those themes were, roughly speaking, supported, that climate change was the most highest priority from consultees, wellbeing and social inclusion the second highest priority. And really just that consultation response has confirmed the use of those themes as we go forward through the plan. There's a lot on this slide and I won't talk you through the whole of it, but in terms of evidence and working towards policy, we're really trying to take an integrated approach to the natural environment topics within the plan. And that cuts across net zero carbon, green infrastructure, water and landscape, which are all themes that have been raised earlier on in the meeting. Net zero carbon is quite an innovative study. There's not many of them around, so we're kind of pushing the boundaries. That's led by Bioregional, and we've been looking at the impacts of the choices that we have, and also standards and policy standards that could be included to really push the maximum energy efficiency and reduce our emissions. Green infrastructure, we published an initial evidence base in November, and now we're working towards identifying projects that could be supported by the plan, having drawn on a number of the evidence bases in terms of opportunity mapping and working with partners and talking to Natural Cambridgeshire and their partners in that. The water study is clearly very important, given the challenges, and particularly in terms of water quality and resources that have been flagged and very much in the news recently. So we very much got that in mind when developing that evidence. And clearly the landscape's been seen as the kind of umbrella within which all of these sit in a way. So that feeds in. And as I say, we're trying to take an integrated approach. So all of these evidence bases connect the consultants that have been talking to each other. And I guess in terms of green infrastructure as I think a bit of a hungry hippo topic in that it encompasses everything really. And so we're trying to feed in the relevant outputs from the other evidence bases into that. Probably important to note in terms of the zero carbon work, the consultants in thinking about new development have very much suggested that mitigation should focus very much on energy efficiency and renewables as the priority. And while there certainly are carbon sequestration opportunities, they shouldn't be seen as the priority for mitigating carbon emissions from development. So they're good in their own right, but not that priority. Clearly also connections between the water in terms of possibly maximising opportunities for green infrastructure there, and the landscape work can really guide what interventions might be appropriate. There is a whole range of other evidence, about 50 evidence bases in total, and I've listed a few of those there. Ones which are particularly related to natural environment is the habitat regulations, which assesses the impact on designated sites of the choices that the plan might make and ensures that those are mitigated if there are impacts. And sustainability appraisal brings together all of the choices that we might have and considers the social, environmental and economic impacts in an integrated way just to inform the decisions that the plan makes. So lastly, and following conversations with Richard and Helen in recent weeks, just set out here really what we think the local plan can do, but noting that in terms of the natural environment, planning is very much limited, and we're really looking to Natural Cambridgeshire partners and other relevant bodies to help us with this work, and leading to the right-hand column really kind of topics which have already been raised today and are kind of well known, but things that we need help from yourselves as experts to deliver, noting the limited impact of planning and trying to make sure that what we do as the planning authorities integrates with what's going on outside of the planning world. So just to kind of touch on some of the highlights. So the local plan and planning policy, obviously policy gets you so far, but it doesn't really do the delivery aspect, and that's a key thing that we would be looking for your input too. In terms of the aspects that the local plan might do in relation to strategy, we would hope that, or we're working towards making sure that the development strategy supports an emerging nature recovery network. That might include allocations supporting green infrastructure projects, and our infrastructure plan would definitely include priority green infrastructure projects to enable us to channel funding towards those. In terms of policy, obviously we're talking about biodiversity net gain, and that will be in the plan. We're seeking to get the highest percentage that we can, recognising that there are challenges in balancing the priorities for funding across other priorities such as affordable housing, and also the need for development to be viable. And we're seeking, as per mentioned in terms of the evidence, to make sure that our policies are integrated across the different natural environment themes and right through the different policies of the plan. In terms of the delivery aspects, the planning authority obviously provides the advice on planning applications to get certain things onto a development. But that's kind of the limit of planning in a sense, and that it only relates to the use of development. And then beyond that, there's a whole host of things that are going to require further help. And so going back to the strategy, clearly there's the work about the emerging nature recovery strategy, and we want to continue to talk with you about how we can best support that. In terms of the delivery, I've noted about administration of biodiversity net gain, and Martin Baker's paper and the conversation that flows from that will clearly be really helpful in terms of something that we'll need to have in place by the time the plan is submitted, is a workable mechanism for how that works. The key challenge for us, recognising, I guess, as one example, Richard's point about dog walkers, is the local plan needs to provide for people and wildlife, and sometimes those conflict, and to acknowledge that there is a large-scale need for green infrastructure for people to take the pressure off nature sites within Greater Cambridge. It's quite a challenge from our perspective as the planning authority, is how do you fund and deliver that, particularly where it's not related to development, because obviously the local plan can only really fund, it can chip in its proportion coming from development. That's not going to get you the whole way. And then lastly, noting that the Future Parks Accelerator work is focused on this, a key challenge, well known, is to ensure that kind of ongoing funding. And that's something, again, all of those topics in that right-hand column is conversations we want to progress with you to ensure that what we do integrates with the wider picture and does the maximum that it can. So that's a run through. So I'll stop there if that's right.
Brilliant, Stuart. Thank you so much for that, and thanks for joining us at a very exciting time in your life. We do wish you and your partner all the very best for that. I'm just conscious of an earlier question that I had, if I may pose to you, which was again from Wendy, and she was asking about, and I have to say I'm ignorant of this, compliance-based conditioning as being something that Greater Cambridgeshire Planning Authority is looking at putting in place, as opposed to enforceable planning conditions. Is that the case, and what does that mean in practice?
I'm going to confess my ignorance here. I would have to take that away and talk to colleagues. I don't know the detail of that, so I'm afraid I can't really answer that just now, but I can take it away and pass on to colleagues to respond.
If you don't mind, and Wendy, I'm sure you're listening, I'll make sure that we follow that up with Stuart and get back in touch with you, try and understand what that is. I can see it's of some concern to the community, so we will have a look at that and try and understand that. Right. Excuse me, I'm trying to see the chat at the same time. One of the questions that's been posed as well, and I guess it isn't something that the plan can address, is there anything in terms of the climate change agenda, Stuart, you need to be addressing around the kind of materials that are being used in building, given that cement is one of the biggest emitters of greenhouse gases in the world?
That is definitely a significant impact or issue to address. So I know our net zero carbon study does look at the building materials and the impacts of those. So I think we would be seeking to go so far as we can in the plan to address that issue, recognising again that it is that the plan itself has only got a limited extent, but it is a topic we are seeking to address in the plan.
Thank you. I've got Dame Fiona has raised her hand. Can you help us with that earlier question? Was it a different issue?
It was a slightly different issue, if you don't mind, Richard. There's some terrific stuff there, and thank you so much, Stuart, for sharing that process with us. I mean, I think for me, one of the interesting things, and I nearly raised it in relation to the ARC before, is that there's lots of focus on biodiversity and nature, which is all vitally important. There's little focus on farming, and particularly farming as the means of delivery of a more sustainable future, whether that's through sustainable soils, through nature recovery, or actually through local food supply and the whole question of reconnecting people to the food network. And I just wondered, you know, that's the sort of big divide we're struggling with in lots of ways. We hope elms will deliver. We don't know elms will deliver. And I just wondered, you know, to what extent, this is why it'd be great to talk further about this. You know, it seems to me this is a largely rural area where farming, you know, is very important, and the future of farming in itself is one of the critical issues that will guide us towards a more sustainable future.
Thank you. Stuart, do you want to, thank you, David. Stuart, do you want to just return on that?
Just so far as I can, I mean, I guess clearly a really, really significant issue. I think for me, this comes back to what planning can do and the limitations of it, in a sense, and that it can only address what is considered to be development, and doing good things to enhance the wildlife benefits of a particular piece of land might not, or very much not, include development. And so having an integrated approach that does as much as we can through planning, but does the things that you are doing as Natural Cambridgeshire partners in terms of actively doing a project is essential to that, because planning can take you so far.
Thanks. If I could just chip in to say that's, I think, precisely the reason why, you know, the Food and Farming and Countryside Commission and others are trying to look at a sort of more opportunities for coming up across those divides. And I think there's a number of people here who are involved in one way or another. So perhaps we can talk about that on another occasion, but thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much indeed. I've got a question from Gavin Shelton at Co-Farm. I've been hearing great things about your work, Gavin. So please go ahead. Question for Stuart, yes?
Yeah, thanks very much, Richard. And it's really also partly just to address Fiona's comment just then, that we have actually been engaging in the process with Greater Cambridge with the shared planning process of feeding in about local food growing as well. So I think there is some stuff embedded within the initial work that's been done around that, and we very much welcome the opportunity to sort of develop that conversation further with you about scaling co-farming as an approach to engaging local communities. And we're also now in discussion with yourselves, Richard, and colleagues at Natural Cambridgeshire as well, about how we might sort of look at multifunctional land use that benefits nature and communities as well around food. And sorry for Wilf, my dog, barking in the background there as well. But thanks so much for the presentations, they've been great.
Thanks, Gavin. I always love to hear the dogs and the cats in the background. It's one of the features of our Zoom world, isn't it? I should declare, by the way, that I am a dog walker as well as a conservationist. So I have literally both feet in both camps. So we'll come back to that. Stuart, a few questions are being asked around biodiversity net gain. What's your views on this, and how do you? I mean, you kind of said in a way, obviously we're in conversation about this, but what do you see as the way forward there? And how important is that going to be, do you think, for delivering our agenda?
Well, it's clearly going to be important, I guess, in terms of being it will be a mandatory requirement. So we'll be there. What the figure is or is up for debate, and so it's likely to be 10% for nationally, but see if we can push the boundaries more locally. I guess in terms of making sure we have a joined up approach to delivery across an area, then the conversation started by Martin is really important, and linking in with the kind of strategic approach to kind of put the money in the right places. I guess I would go back to saying that firstly, that I think we would be seeking to put it on site so far as we can. That's my understanding from colleagues that know a lot more, that is the right thing to do. But secondly, that any money that came out would only, again, get you so far, and you need to kind of bring that together with other funding to kind of really push forward the big projects that might be really beneficial. And then thirdly, again, that's biodiversity net gain, but in seeking to help biodiversity, we need to find ways of funding other types of sites as well. And so from our perspective, we're trying to, and we haven't got there yet, but think about the range of standards that we can include in the local plan that kind of produce an integrated approach to supporting biodiversity, but the people's needs for green spaces too. Recognizing that there's a whole host of standards out there, and to enable the right things to be delivered and the right funding to be gathered, but making those work together, particularly noting kind of talk around wider environmental net gain, kind of emerging. That is a challenge for us, is to provide a kind of comprehensive but integrated approach to biodiversity net gain and the other things that you might put around that.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've had some questions in the chat about environmental net gain, and of course there's some really interesting papers published by Helen, I think, wasn't it, recently, looking at that. So again, just for the rest of the group's appreciation, we've kicked off conversations with Stuart and his team, and also somewhere on the call I saw Richard Kay, to look at this and to look at how we can embed biodiversity net gain. Yes, strategy, we know it's coming, but that doesn't mean it will work for us. We want to make sure we have a regime that works for us and that really actively supports the doubling nature agenda. We will be arguing, Natural Cambridgeshire will be arguing for a higher figure than 10%, because I take Brian's point, 10%, who knows? This is not an exact science, so we need to have some real ambition. And if we're going to double nature, then we need to be more ambitious. And I think that also is about setting out, the parameters for Cambridgeshire. We want this to be a place that excels rather than just does the norm. Tim, you've got your hand up. Tim Brightmeyer, one of our trustees at Natural Cambridgeshire.
Thank you, Richard. Stuart, the current provision of domestic water supply in Cambridgeshire has severely damaged some of the riverine ecology and biodiversity already. The next 10 to 15 years, there is no further supply solution coming forward. How do you plan to solve that problem in your build-out strategy? Is water capture a key part of your plan?
Huge question for you there, Stuart. I've got 3 or 4 minutes, and then we're going to move to our mayoral candidate. So perhaps you can elaborate on this one, because I know many people are interested in this, quite rightly.
Tim, thank you. Can I just check water capture? Could you just define that for me? Forgive me, I'm not a specialist in this area.
Is your design strategy going to include capturing rainwater off people's roofs?
Okay.
And capture the runoff from the masses of acres of concrete you're going to provide? Because there is no more underground water for you to continue to feed off.
Okay, thank you. So we recognise that water supply and the impact on water quality and wildlife impacts is a critical issue. I don't know if you noted, but in November we published initial water evidence, and that tested the growth levels that we've identified. It said that the minimum level could be provided using existing infrastructure, that the medium potentially, but that the high maximum growth level was a deal breaker, it described it as, which is quite strong language from evidence-based consultants. And that evidence base is a particular element specifically for peer review of that feature. The local plan will have to prove that it is deliverable and that the impacts that it has can be mitigated. And so if infrastructure is needed and it can't come through, and the message was that it's not that you can't provide the water, but that something significant such as a new reservoir would be needed to supply it. And so the plan, by showing it's deliverable, will have to address that point. And so that might mean holding back delivery of development until a solution was found. But the local plan will not get through a planning inspector without showing that it is actually deliverable and can mitigate the impacts that it has. Oh, sorry, lastly, so you mentioned water capture. So, and part of that, whether a low, medium or high growth option was selected, would have to include very strong water efficiency standards, including such things as grey water capture and so forth. So we will be seeking to push the boundaries of water efficiency, whatever, essentially.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Stuart, for that. And thank you very much indeed, as I say, for joining us. And I would just, like to say thank you and your team for engaging us so fully in this. That there are lots and lots of very, very intricate and difficult questions. But I can say to everybody here that Stuart and his team are very, are involving us in these conversations all the way through and listening very carefully to what we have to say. I think, again, going back to Brian's point, perhaps in 1995, he wouldn't have been, on the list of people to talk to in quite the same way. So there is change and encouragement there. So thank you, Stuart, and thank you for giving us your time today. Really appreciate it. Okay, thank you all for your attention so far. Thank you so much for all the comments in the chat. Forgive me again, I can't get through them all, but you can read them all yourselves and you can be be aware of those. We're going to move now to the final session of our partnership forum today, and I'm delighted that both Mayor James Palmer and Aidan van der Veer, the Lib Dem candidate, are both with us. I've seen them both. And we want to talk to our mayoral candidates about the natural environment. We have posed to them all a very simple question. If you are elected mayor, what will you do to accelerate the doubling nature ambition across Cambridgeshire? And we have a supplementary, which will be about, okay, how are you going to resource that? And how are you going to persuade central government to invest in this agenda? Because of the limits on our time here, we are not going to be then having a sort of question time session where we throw questions back and forth. I'm sorry if that disappoints people. It's just how we can manage our time and also ensure strict fairness to the candidates. So I really do want to make sure that's the case. Now, my understanding, I'm going to look at my colleague Peter here, Peter Lanzov, is that the Labour candidate, Dr. Nick Johnson, can't be with us for personal reasons, and that one of his colleagues is going to read a statement. Is that correct, Peter?
Yes, Nick does send his apologies. He's actually at his father's funeral right now.
I'm so sorry. Yeah, well, let's send him our sincere condolences.
So Nigel Pawley will read his contribution.
Thank you, Peter. And Nigel, if you can make yourself known and read that contribution, that would be very, very helpful. I can't see you. Are you on the call somewhere? There we go. Nigel, thank you and welcome, and thank you for picking this up in the difficult circumstances. We do appreciate that.
Okay. Well, firstly, apologies that Nick isn't here. He's. I'll read this letter out from him, or this statement, and I'm sure moving forward he'd be happy to answer any of your questions in person. Dear friends and members of the Natural Cambridgeshire Partnership Forum, my sincere apologies I will not be with you for today's meeting. Unfortunately, just as you were sitting down to what sounds like a fantastic meeting to talk about environmental challenges and green issues that are very dear to my heart, I'll be preparing for my dad's funeral back up in Northumberland. My dad, Dave Ellis Johnson, was my absolute rock and always an inspiration for everything I do. Although we never quite understood why I would spend so much time with what he called the political thing, he was always the first to encourage me to speak out, stand up for my and his socialist and green beliefs, and to always work for the betterment of all society. I owe everything I have achieved in my political journey to the values that my dad and my mum instilled in me from a very early age. I'm forever grateful for the standards and beliefs that helped shape in my childhood. I remain inspired by them now as much as I was back in my youth and my political awakenings in the 1980s. My dad was a passionate believer and campaigner for all that is important and good about the living world. Its nature, its beauty, and its importance to us all in terms of good health and mental well-being and the importance of sustainability. As a working class lad from inner Sheffield, he learned at a very early age the joy of getting out of the city to the Derbyshire Peak District as part of the woodcraft folk, and how the countryside is an important asset to us all. He was green before it became fashionable, and making much of the mantra, make good and repair, years ahead of reduce, reuse and recycle. As a kid, helping my dad by digging potatoes on his allotment, I learned the benefit of sustainable food, low food mileage, and the sheer fantastic taste of growing your own food. I did not realize at the time that I was learning and beginning to understand the importance of how we interact with the world, nature, and the environment around us. He taught me, if you look after nature, nature will look after you. I'm sorry that these words are heavy on personal sentiment and experience, but in the current circumstances, I find it challenging to do justice to your organisation and provide the amount of detail that you deserve for such an important issue in all our lives, and one that is a hugely important issue for the Mayor, the combined authority area of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. I'm absolutely committed to the aims and ambition of the doubling nature movement, and to me, it is an absolute priority within the future planning of all local government bodies, our parish, our town, our district, and our county councils, all to be empowered by the ambition of the combined authority. I'm a country boy. I grew up in rural Northumberland, and although the topography and soil, the farming, and the countryside are very different here in the east, I am at heart still a young boy, a young ornithologist, and would-be David Bellamy, who recognises the beauty and importance of the natural world around us. I want my 3 children to grow up in a world where we recognise the economic and spiritual value of the environment. We need a world that is not just focused on the benefits of unbridled economic growth for the sake of, or growth for growth's sake, but a world where the damaging effects we cause as we rush to exploit the world's finite resources are acknowledged, and we begin to make the necessary huge changes, both individually and as a society, in our day-to-day behaviour. And that starts locally. We need to look at our local plans for growth and development and always be mindful of the negative effects as well as the positives. We cannot keep exploiting our precious and limited water resources, damaging the incredibly important chalk stream aquifers, drying up riverbeds, while at the same time fighting the floods of winter and spring with damages to houses and livelihoods along the Great Ouse, the Nene and the Cam. I highlighted this in an article I wrote recently for the local paper. I'd like to repeat it to you. It was a 17th century writer, vicar and Cambridge University graduate, Thomas Fuller, who memorably wrote that we never know the worth of water till the well is dry. Some 400 years after he penned those words of wisdom, I'm very concerned about water scarcity in Cambridgeshire and how we cope with future demand as our region continues to grow. The careful management of our natural water resources has long been a feature of our daily lives for those living in Cambridge City and the wider Cambridgeshire areas. From the revolutionary design of Hobson's conduit to Bermudan's wide-scale draining of our fens, the health and economic fortunes of our communities have been directly linked to an understanding of how to manage the aquatic resource is far too easy to take for granted. There is a huge irony that whilst many riverside communities were blighted by widespread Christmas flooding, the converse problem of Cambridgeshire's worsening water stress status continues to grow. Be it too much or be it too little, the importance of water management resources has never been so important as it is today. Let me be clear that to avoid a drought crisis, we've all got to act together with urgency. The Mayor, along with the combined authority executive, must come up with solutions to the challenges faced. We cannot continue to face the paradox of wintertime flooding and summers of dried riverbeds and a falling natural chalk aquifer. At the very heart of the solution, I believe, is a willingness to collaborate and embrace change in local district and county council development policy, coupled with a readiness to work alongside the statutory bodies, such as the Environment Agency and privately owned water companies. With the economic benefits of growth in residential, industrial and business developments come the primary responsibility to protect our local environment. Short-term economic growth accounts for nothing if the longer-term damage leads to a greater cost for all. The combined authority needs to work with all partners to substantially reduce groundwater abstraction from the aquifer that feeds our chalk streams. There needs to be investment in water recycling schemes with planned sewage treatments, upgrades focused on treated water being used for public supplies and recharge in the aquifer. Similar investment needs to be made in the harvesting of rainwater, recycling of grey water and ensuring all new housing developments embrace this technology. I believe the combined authority should lead by example and set a target for our region to become the #1 water saving area in the country. At the same time, individual responsibility has to be encouraged through widespread advice and education on using water efficiently and economically. I believe that with cooperation across the board, we can find solutions to the growing water scarcity crisis facing our modern day communities. You ask simply what I would do to ensure the investment. I reply, I will not stop as Mayor until the importance of these issues is acted upon and we all begin to make those changes. As a children's doctor, it's sometimes hard to convince the parents, let alone the child, that horrible tasting medicine will solve the problem. I see myself as a doctor of 3 C's: compassion, cooperation, and community, who has to take that public challenge. The doctor who is willing to focus on the importance of public health, who is willing to focus on a green agenda, and the Doctor Mayor who can ultimately convince central government that the investment is needed and a failure to support that vision, to have failed to acknowledge the issue staring us in the face, will ultimately lead to a much greater cost to us all. I hope these words, although spoken through someone else, will convey to you all my passion and commitment to your cause, and I look forward to a time when I can speak and meet you all in person to work out how we get there. Thank you again for the invite. I hope you enjoy your meeting. Take care and keep up the good work. I'm with you in this fight, Dr. Nick Johnson.
Well, thank you so much for conveying that message to us. It's very helpful. And please, on our behalf, do pass our condolences to Dr. Nick at a very difficult time. But thank you for stepping in, and thank you for that message. It's very helpful.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. I should have said, by the way, just in case anyone's worried, we've chosen the candidates on alphabetical order. So that's the only reason we're doing it this way. I do apologise to the 3 of you if that doesn't suit. We'll have to sort that out some other way in the future. But as a result, next up of our 3 candidates that we have with us today is the current Mayor, Mayor James Palmer. Good morning, Mayor. Thank you for sparing your time. Thank you for joining us. And I wonder if you'd be happy to effectively answer the same question. You know, what would you do if you're returned as Mayor in May to accelerate the doubling nature agenda?
Yes, and thank you. Good morning, Richard, and good morning, everybody, and thank you for asking me along this morning. Actually, this meeting is timely. You, I'm sure, have seen the launch of our Climate Commission interim report yesterday, and the work that Baroness Brown rather has been doing on my behalf, on behalf of the people of Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. What became very clear to me as Mayor was that there's a cacophony of noise around environmental change, climate change, etc. But there was nothing bespoke in particular that was done to inform Cambridgeshire and Peterborough of the best policies that we could use to produce the best solutions for our county. And that was the remit with which I went to Baroness Brown, and when she very kindly agreed to chair the Climate Commission. And what I wanted to create through the Climate Commission was a document of the gravitas of the Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Independent Economic Review, which has formed much of the thinking, the policy of the combined authority, and also of individual councils since its work was released around 3 years ago. Certainly, there's lots of ambition within Cambridgeshire to create a double nature, etc., but also create a more environmentally sustainable county. And somehow I've got to find a way to do that alongside a significant growth agenda and an economy that is delivering more jobs than it is housing. So we have to have an honesty of what is needed, but also I believe that we need to run through that growth agenda with a golden thread, an environmental policy that is bespoke for our county. I've certainly spoken with individuals that I can see on this call already when it comes to doubling nature and other improvements in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, and I think we have possibly a unique opportunity to do so over the course of the next 10 years or so. And I say that because of several reasons linked to the agricultural economy. My background is agriculture. I was a farmer for some 25 years. My family's a farming family, and it's something that I'm very passionate about. What we've seen in agriculture is a common agricultural policy which has not been fit for Cambridgeshire, nor has been fit for nature. Now that we have a chance to redress that, I know the government are looking very closely at options to improve nature support of farming through a different kind of common agricultural policy. And I believe that will help us locally and nationally. The other point that has been raised and was brought up yesterday is the government's policy on re-wetting the fens, and that's something that the report yesterday suggested a committee set up with farmers to work on how we can sustainably bring forward the government peak policy while still protecting one of the most important agricultural areas in the entire world, and certainly one of the most productive agricultural areas in the entire world. Cambridgeshire, of course, has got a lack of nature because of its history of being the breadbasket of the UK. And if you eat vegetables from a UK supermarket, the likelihood is that they've come from the Cambridgeshire fens. So whilst we have the ability to look very closely in the agreement with farmers to work together through the Climate Change Commission, and we have, and I've agreed to form a committee with the agricultural community. We're going to put in around 50,000 to that, and I've asked farmers to match that ambition for us to put forward through the agricultural community a clear agenda of doubling nature, and of course creating greater fenland wetland areas, whilst, as I say, protecting the vital industry that employs so many people in this county. I'm very excited by the government's green bond scheme. I think that certainly is going to be a way that we can bring forward sites and create nature sites from growth in this county. I've always been very much in favour of tackling our housing deficit by building new towns linked with infrastructure. Of course, Cam Metro is the major policy that we have set forward to do that. In aspect, I don't actually believe it's possible to build the homes necessary in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough without devastating the environment, unless we build them in garden towns. Certainly, if I look at the history of the local plan system and its negative impact on housing in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough, and its negative impact on nature, I think that teaches us a very stark lesson as to what's best for this county. When we look at creating green space with housing developments, it certainly seems to me that we need to do more than put a chicken on a spring in a park. When we're creating garden towns, our ability to develop actual nature parkland rather than just green space, I think there's a significant difference between the two, is incredibly important. We know one of the legacies of the great Victorian cities of the UK is the incredible amount of green space that was created through parkland, and that's something that we've really forgotten to do, and our parkland should dominate our new towns rather than the other way around. And if you are creating parkland from agricultural land, of course, you are doubling nature, and something that should be front and centre of our planning policy. But clearly that needs honesty. There needs to be honesty with the general public about the need for housing. And one of the things that I've learned through 100k homes policy is the need for housing far outweighs the traditional NIMBY anti-growth agenda. Certainly for our homes in Fordham, if the interest is replicated in those homes across the county, the need for young people to get on the housing market is around 20,000 homes, and that actually ties in very well with the predictions for homes necessary for Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. So I think that we have to have a completely honest discussion, stop hiding behind local plans. The agenda for doubling nature must be hand in hand with the agenda for growth, and that's exactly what the Climate Commission has offered. Of course, the full report will be out in September, and as I said before, I fully expect it to become the vanguard for how local authorities deliver climate change solutions within local areas. So much of the climate change agenda is nationalised or internationalised, and it's what we can do in our own backyard will make the difference to the health and the well-being of the people of this county, and to the way that they move around and the way that they live their lives. Sometimes climate change can seem very distant to the general population. Those who are passionate about it are extraordinarily so, but of course polling shows that it's usually around fifth or sixth on the things that concern people. However, it's my concern that if we continue along the route that we've been delivering growth in this county and in this country without bespoke solutions locally, that we will never actually solve the issues that are before us. So it can seem that Cambridgeshire and Peterborough is a very small cog in an international climate wheel. But I think in actual fact, through our Climate Change Commission, through the exceptional work of the team that Baroness Brown has put together, through the government's commitment to zero carbon, and through the government's policies such as green bonds, our opportunity to influence rather than talk about doubling nature in Cambridgeshire and Peterborough is probably greater now, or certainly greater now than it has ever been. So my commitment to this group, my commitment to the people of Cambridgeshire is absolute, in that we will do whatever we can to make sure that the work that the team carry out on behalf of the Combined Authority is front and centre of our policies into the future. And of course, the beauty of a Combined Authority is that individual members of that authority can use the information that this commission will bring forward to enhance their planning policies and allow some of the points that have been made by others to be delivered. Thank you.
Mayor, thank you very much indeed. Thank you again for taking the time to be with us and to give us your thoughts on our agenda and how you can help take that forward. That was very clear and very helpful. So I'm going to turn finally to Aidan van der Veer, who is the Lib Dem candidate. Sorry that you're the third of the candidates, Aidan. You need to change your name or something. Perhaps you could have gone on Christian names and you could have gone first. I don't know. But thank you also for sparing us the time, and we'd love to hear from you on your thoughts about how we can accelerate the doubling nature ambition.
Good morning. Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I think the environment is going to be one of the key themes of this election, both climate change and biodiversity, how they interact with each other, how residents can contribute to and benefit from our action in these areas. My aim as Mayor is to create a greener and fairer Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. And fairness is vital to our thinking on how we approach nature, as well as supporting green growth. We need to ensure that our interventions on nature contribute to tackling inequality. And this can happen in a whole range of ways. The green spaces that enhance well-being and quality of life, especially in the more deprived areas, to skilling up our young people for the green recovery that we need to shape as we come out of the COVID pandemic. The Mayor has a critical leadership role in nature recovery. He, and it does look like it's going to be, he has to set out an ambition for transforming nature in Cambridgeshire that goes well beyond what the Mayor can do directly. And this is exactly what the role of Mayor was created to do, not do everything himself, but show leadership, bring people together around a common vision, empower communities to take action and be the voice of Cambridgeshire. So the relationship between improving nature and the growth that we are experiencing is a very interesting one. What we've been talking about today, what all the speakers have been talking about today, isn't really conservation of nature. We all recognise what a terrible state so much of our natural environment is in. Rather, we're looking at improvement and enhancement. This needs both change and more resources. The growth that this area, growth that's happening in this area must be harnessed for that, to enable the urgent change to what we do and how we manage nature. It's also important to emphasise that the benefits to the economy of a resilient and diverse natural environment are huge. So it works both ways. And that needs to be recognised more clearly in policy and in law and in our whole approach to nature. The vision for the Fen Biosphere designation, I think, is a very good example of how these different layers of interventions on nature can come together in a way that's positive for all. The fen landscape that is so characteristic of our county. It's dominated by the arable farming that feeds the whole country. It's currently, I mean, it is crisscrossed by really special natural habitats, waterways, wetlands, as well as a whole range of heritage assets. That landscape has been profoundly shaped by humans as we sought to exploit the productivity of the soils. But over the last 400 years, we haven't done so well at making the most of the opportunities to enrich the nature of the fens. And we haven't managed to promote the fens as an attractive place for visitors. So this is, I think, an ideal moment to move to a new stage of our relationship with fens, with for example, the increase in holidays in the UK caused by the pandemic, with greater awareness the issue of biodiversity, the importance of biodiversity and local healthy food production, with more concern about the inequalities of Cambridgeshire. I think it is time to find a new balance between all the range of uses in this area, between nature, residents, farmers, visitors, and the economy more broadly. Just seeing on this example, the UNESCO designation for the Fen biosphere would give the strategy for re-establishing that balance a big credibility boost that will help us bring together partners, so that then the action of each of us individually is really enhanced through better coordination. Also a good way of engaging better with the public, both through the time of creation of the biosphere, when we need public input then, but also doing the ongoing work. This is just one example of how we can local authorities can sort of support things that do improve things for our residents, but also for the natural environment. Another good example that we've touched on briefly so far is about the increasing attention on farming practices and how they relate to nature. Across the county, but in the Fens in particular. I mean, the Commission on Climate, which we've already mentioned, has been starting to look at the issue of climate emissions from peatlands and how we can reduce that while supporting food production. South Cambridgeshire District Council helped fund the fantastic film that was released last month that Martin Lyons, who features in it, has already mentioned, and he put a link in there in the chat. That film looks in detail at how farmers are embracing techniques of regenerative farming that work with the soils and plants to improve biodiversity, reduce emissions while maintaining output. I'm sure if you haven't already seen it, please do. It's called From the Ground Up. And it's going to take a lot of effort to go from just having from a handful of farmers using regenerative techniques now to mass adoption, and local authorities and the mayor in particular can have a really important role in making that happen. As we see in this film, in local government, we can use our skills and resources, access to bring learning together to really promote a vision to the public. Another area that we've already touched on is that needs huge change is water management. The crisis in our water supply is doing terrible damage both to the natural environment and, as we've discussed, restricting the creation of much needed new homes. For decades, we've just been taking more water out of the chalk aquifer, more water than goes in, and it is now getting depleted. And for too long we have neglected this issue, leaving it to the future to sort out. The future has now arrived, and we do need to now address this. As mayor, I'll be committed to stopping this damage, putting our water supply on a sustainable course, and I'm building on the work that I've been doing in my role at South Cambridgeshire, that again, we have already discussed, particularly through planning. So we see this problem most starkly with the condition of the chalk streams in southern Cambridgeshire, where water flow can stop entirely during dry periods, and water has to be pumped in, and the ecosystems in and around the chalk streams just can't survive. The work that the local plan that South Cambs and Cambridge City have done on water management shows clearly that there is a hard limit to the number of homes that can be accommodated, and on the amount of water taken out of the aquifer needs to be reduced. There are solutions to this. Nearby areas have plentiful water, but to get there needs long-term investment and action on a regional scale with the Environment Agency, water companies, government, and the mayor is really perfectly placed to enable that to happen. Likewise, with the flooding of recent months right across the country, that's really brought home how important a well-managed and diverse landscape plays in that. So with more flood meadows, more wetlands, more plants, the slow flows help the soil retain water, really, really important to that. And that's how, so we can see another example there of how increasing that nature and the diversity of nature helps the whole of society and the whole of the place. Over the last few years, when I've been during which time I've been deputy leader of South Cambridgeshire, my colleagues and I have really transformed our approach to nature. we now have the environment recognised as a key pillar in the Oxford-Cambridge arc, largely in large part due to our efforts. We've adopted our own doubling nature strategy to fit in with Natural Cambridgeshire's. We are really pushing the local plan to the limits of policy on the environment with the call for green sites, the green and blue infrastructure studies, the water management study, as well as the climate change assessment. The Mayor and the combined authority as a whole need to be at the forefront of getting policy and legal changes needed from local authorities and from central government to really push the doubling nature strategy with the urgency that we've been discussing. I think we now do have the opportunity now to come together to make Cambridgeshire and Peterborough greener and fairer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Aidan, for that. And I'd like to thank all three of you. I'd pass on our thanks to giving your time. And I'm sorry to sort of essentially we've listened to you and we posed our question. We don't have time to follow up and other questions. I am very grateful for you taking the time to join us. And I think the message I'd like to leave the three of you with is that, you know, we are here and very passionate about this agenda, but we're here to help. So whichever of you is mayor after the election, please can we ensure that we have really strong engagement. We'd love to come and sit down with you very early on to look at how do we take forward the Climate Change Commission's recommendation, which is about that leadership role in accelerating double nature. We're full of very practical ideas for how that can be done. So I really do hope that you will treat us as one of as one of your key partners in the future of our wonderful county. So thank you very much indeed for your time. I think, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our time this morning. We've had a lot of a lot of really good conversation, both from our presenters. Thank you very much to them, but from you in the chat as well. It's quite difficult for me actually, because on the one hand I want to listen to my presenters, obviously, but the chat's fascinating. So I kind of find my head sort of switching backwards and forwards between the two. We have recorded the session, and we will make it available on the Natural Cambridgeshire website. But I did just want to thank you all for your commitment to nature and nature recovery and for your individual support for Natural Cambridgeshire. We really do have a lot to do, but I think as our presenters and our mayoral candidates have shown, it does feel to me that perhaps we're no longer crying in the wilderness about the nature of the biodiversity crisis. And I think there's a realization that the time to act is now. And actually, when you look at all the stuff that's going on the ground across Cambridgeshire, tremendous vibrancy as communities start to take control and deliver nature recovery. So we'll be meeting again on I'm going to look at Peter, 15th of June, I think is our next session. Peter will correct me if I'm wrong. If I'm right, he'll probably just stay quiet. So he's not said anything. Now here he is, Peter, 15th of June.
That is right, yes.
Thank you. So we'll meet again in the same format on the 15th of June, and we will continue to communicate with you through our weekly emails and updates and through our website, and look forward to working with you all to take this agenda forward. Thank you so much for your time this morning.